Joseph, governor of Egypt, is one of the most well-known characters in the Bible. At the same time, his wife is one of the most unknown people in the biblical text. The Bible reports that Joseph was in a prominent position in Egypt when he met Asenath, who would become his wife. Although her name is mentioned only a few times in the scriptures, the figure of this mysterious woman has aroused the curiosity of generations throughout the centuries. Several traditions and interpretations have sought to fill the gaps left by the biblical account, either through midrash readings or Jewish legends found in apocryphal writings. To give you an idea, some versions even suggest that Joseph might have married his own niece. But does that make sense? Who was, after all, this woman so relevant in Joseph's life and in the unfolding of crucial events of the history of Israel? This is exactly what we will talk about from now on in this video. According to the biblical text in the book of Genesis, Joseph was taken as a slave to Egypt at a very young age after being sold by his own brothers. The text records that Joseph was in the house of Potiphera, an officer of Pharaoh, when he began to stand out due to his administrative ability and, above all, for his faithfulness and moral integrity. Later, because of false accusation promoted by Potiphar's wife, Joseph ended up in prison. However, even in adversity, Joseph demonstrated wisdom by correctly interpreting the dreams of his fellow cellmates. Then later, when Pharaoh had disturbing dreams and none of the wise men of Egypt could interpret them, Joseph was called to fulfill this mission. According to the biblical account, by unraveling the meaning of the dreams, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, Joseph ensured not only his release, but also a place of honor in the Egyptian court. The text indicates that Pharaoh, impressed by Joseph's prophetic and administrative abilities, gave him a new name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and gave him a wife, Asenath. The few references to Asenath found in the Bible are mainly concentrated in Genesis 41, where it mentions that she was the daughter of Potiphera, a priest of the city of On. This city, also known as Heliopolis by the Greeks, was located in the Nile Delta region, near what is now modern Cairo. On was the center of sun worship in Egypt, with Ra being one of its most important deities. The name of Asenath's father, Potiphera, means gift of Ra, indicating that Asenath was raised in the context of Egyptian polytheism and religious traditions associated with sun worship. The Bible does not provide detailed information about her daily life, but as the daughter of a priest, it is presumed that she belonged to one of the most privileged classes of Egyptian society at that time. Scholars believe that the name Asenath is a transliteration of an Egyptian name meaning something like belonging to the goddess Neith or dedicated to the goddess Neith, an Egyptian deity generally associated with war and hunting. In the biblical text, the moment Joseph marries Asenath is directly linked to his rise to the position of governor of Egypt. In other words, the text does not detail any period of courtship between Joseph and Asenath before the marriage. It simply records that Pharaoh himself decided to give her as a wife to his new administrator. It is possible that Pharaoh thought it important to strengthen ties between the priestly family and his new royal authority. Joseph was about 30 years old at this time, and there is no mention in the Bible of any other marriage on his part, indicating that Asenath may have been his only wife. The Bible also informs that Asenath had 2 sons with Joseph during the period of abundance that preceded the years of famine predicted in Pharaoh's dreams. The first son was named Manasseh, which means one who makes a get. According to the text, Joseph attributed the choice of this name to the fact that God helped him forget all the sufferings he had gone through up to that point, including the longing for his father's house. The second son was named Ephraim, whose meaning conveys the idea of being fruitful or prosperous. Joseph explained this name by declaring, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." These names thus reveal the hope and gratitude that Joseph nurtured. even living in a foreign land, far from his brothers and his father Jacob. Later, in Genesis chapter 48, the biblical text reveals that the patriarch Jacob, upon reuniting with Joseph, in a sense adopted his two sons, giving them a special blessing. This made Manasseh and Ephraim fathers of tribes within Israel alongside the other sons of Jacob. When Jacob laid his hand on them, however, something unusual happened. Ephraim, the younger, received the principal blessing instead of Manasseh. Joseph even tried to correct his father by positioning his hands properly, but Jacob insisted that his choice was being guided by divine revelation. Thus, Ephraim became the most numerous and influential tribe in the northern kingdom of Israel, producing notable figures such as Joshua and the prophet Samuel. Despite Asenath's fundamental role in consolidating Joseph's family, the Bible does not offer details about her life beyond what has already been mentioned. Her participation in the biblical story ends as soon as the births of Manasseh and Ephraim are mentioned. There is no record of when and how she died, nor how she dealt with life in the Egyptian court alongside Joseph. It is also not known exactly how her relationship with her father-in-law Jacob was, or even with Joseph's brothers who came to live in Egypt after the great famine that struck the land. This silence is a common phenomenon in some Old Testament texts, especially when it comes to women who entered the lineage or history of the people of Israel, but did not have a prophetic or leadership role explicitly recognized. Additionally, the fact that Asenath was Egyptian raises even more curiosity because she was the mother of two patriarchs of Israelite tribes, which raises questions about her religious stance and her involvement with monotheistic faith. Given the gaps in Asenath's history, it is not surprising that Jewish tradition sought explanations to answer the following question. How could Joseph, a direct descendant Jacob, marry an Egyptian daughter of a pagan priest and still have children fully included in the covenant? Various legends, interpretations, and even apocryphal texts have emerged to address this point. For example, midrash, a genre of rabbinic literature that often elaborates and expands biblical stories for theological or pedagogical purposes, proposes two main interpretations about Asenath. In one of these interpretations, Asenath is identified as the daughter of Dinah, Jacob's only daughter. According to this narrative, after the tumultuous episode involving Dinah's violation by Shechem, Dinah would have become pregnant, and the born girl would have been sent to Egypt, where she was taken in by Potiphera or Potiphera and raised by him as an adopted daughter. In this version, Asenath's adoptive father would be the same Potiphera whom Joseph served in Egypt before being imprisoned due to a false accusation made by his wife. In some variations of this interpretation, Potiphera had planned to kill Joseph, but Asenath warned him that he was innocent. Therefore, instead of executing him, Potiphera opted to send him to prison. Additionally, as proof of Asenath's Israelite origin, the midrash claims that Jacob had placed an amulet around the girl's neck before she was sent to Egypt, containing an inscription dedicating her to the God of Israel. Thus, many years later, Joseph supposedly recognized this amulet, realizing that Asenath was actually part of Jacob's household rather than Egyptian, and thus the marriage would not violate his ethnic and religious purity. In another interpretation, Asenath was indeed an Egyptian woman raised in the polytheistic context, but converted to monotheism upon meeting Joseph. In fact, the biblical texts record that Joseph was completely submissive to the God of Israel, and this faithfulness could have influenced his wife. Thus, she would become a proselyte, rejecting the gods of Egypt. This interpretative approach obviously seems to have arisen to highlight the idea that, at various times, foreign women were welcomed into the tradition of Israel by sincerely embracing the Jewish faith and conduct, like Rahab and Ruth. Thus, Asenath, in this sense, would be another case of genuine conversion. becoming worthy of seeing her children fully integrated into the people of the covenant. This curiosity about the relationship between Joseph and Asenath was so significant at some point that it even led to an apocryphal work known as Joseph and Asenath, which provides one of the most extensive and romanticized narratives about the meeting of Jacob's son and his wife in Egypt. This work, written in Greek, never became part of the biblical canon, but may have circulated since the Hellenistic period. The work was possibly produced in Alexandria between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE in the Roman period. Its author remains unknown, although it is presumed that he was Jewish, or at least someone connected to Jewish culture in the diaspora. In this text, divided into 2 parts, the story takes on typical contours of a Greek romance. The author provides detailed descriptions of the first meeting between Joseph and Asenath, initially marked by mutual rejection. In the work, the character of Asenath appears as a rich, extremely beautiful young woman, but proud of her origin. Joseph, for his part, shows some distance, refusing to take a wife who worships strange gods. Gradually, however, Asenath is touched by Joseph's character and faith and begins a process of sincere repentance illustrated by fasting and prayers to the God of Israel. In the development of the text, Joseph and Asenath finally overcome their differences, and she converts, renouncing the idols. The first part ends with the marriage of the two. In the second part of the work, a conflict arises involving Pharaoh's son, who falls in love with Asenath and conspires to eliminate Joseph. The resolution of the work is marked by scenes of persecution and twists that culminate in the prince's death and Joseph's unexpected coronation as Pharaoh. Obviously, this narrative goes beyond everything presented in the biblical text. Joseph and Asenath exhibits traits of fiction and epic romance, probably with the intention of addressing, in a Hellenized context, issues such as the validity of mixed marriages, the importance of repentance, and the role of the people of Israel amid foreign cultures. Therefore, this work should not be given any historical authority over the true relationship between Joseph and Asenath, although as an ancient document. It has its usefulness as a testimony to the development of Jewish thought and literature during the diaspora. Now, returning to midrash interpretations about Asenath's story, although these versions also do not belong to the biblical canon, they demonstrate the rabbinical thoughts concerned in explaining how Manasseh and Ephraim, Asenath's descendants, could receive such important blessings to the point of becoming leaders of Israelite tribes. In both interpretations, whether the one in which Asenath has an Israelite origin or the one where she is a convert to the faith of Israel, the rabbinic efforts to show that divine providence guided history in a way that ensured Jacob's lineage remained intact and free of negative implications that could arise from mixed marriages become clear, thus satisfying the theological and identity expectations of the Jewish people. Between the two versions, the idea that Asenath converted to the God of Israel seems obviously the more natural interpretation, and the one that makes the most sense. After all, nothing prevents Asenath from being sensitized by Joseph's accounts of divine promises, thus assuming faith in the God of Israel and abandoning her former gods. On the other hand, the version that tries to establish an alleged Israelite lineage for Asenath seems much more fanciful and dependent on interpretative arrangements. Either way, it is important to recognize that Joseph's life was marked by divine providence and that his exile in Egypt was not a coincidence, but part of a greater plan, not only to save many peoples from famine, but also to preserve the covenant family within the history of redemption. In this context, the mysterious Asenath was further proof of how God can fulfill his promise, even in unlikely circumstances, choosing and transforming the daughter of an Egyptian priest into a matriarch of Israel's lineage. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one.